Supporters of Brazil's former president Jair Bolsonaro stormed that country's capital.
It was a scene eerily similar to 2021's insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. Let's get right to Fox 5's Dan Bowens. He is in Passo Fundo, Brazil this morning with more. Good morning, Dan. How are you?
Good morning to Shawnee. Good morning to Shawnee and Robert. You know, I came to Brazil on vacation with my family. Bom dia. That means good morning. We knew that some of this stuff was going on with the political scene. It's something that all families down here talking about. So many people talking about it, but we didn't think that it would boil over into the scene that we saw play out yesterday. Now, I'm in Passo Fundo with my family. That's a long way from Brasilia, where some of this stuff is happening inside that nation's capital, inside Congress, inside the Supreme Court. But it is something that we watched play out on television here. So many families tuned in to their screens as this all happened. It's violence that so many Americans will be familiar with. We watched it here as supporters of former President Jair Bolsonaro stormed that country's Congress in the capital of Brasilia. Protesters also broke into the presidential palace and the Supreme Federal Court. You can see the damage and destruction inside. People just made a mess in there. It's a scene many Americans will be all too familiar with. January 6th, just 2 years ago. And a very similar circumstance. These supporters of Bolsonaro refused to accept the results of the last election, showing the current president, Lula da Silva, won it very closely. President Lula da Silva was sworn in just a week ago after narrowly beating Bolsonaro in an October runoff. Now, following the results, there were protests in Brazil. There were protests here in Passo Fundo, where I am, protests all across the country, but nothing like what is unfolding right now. We've not yet heard from Bolsonaro about the actions of his supporters. The former Brazilian leader is actually in Florida, in the United States right now. He claims he has to be there because he thinks Lula is going to come after him. Now, some of Lula's supporters say that's just ridiculous. It's all a show. President Lula da Silva said today that several of Bolsonaro's previous speeches actually encouraged this type of unrest, indicating that the former Brazilian president could now be investigated. And as we mentioned, it is a familiar circumstance for many Americans. I was watching television yesterday and I felt like I was back where I was 2 years ago, watching things happen at the Capitol. We know that leaders all across the country have condemned what happened here, have condemned this violence, including President Joe Biden. We also heard from Brooklyn Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, and here's what he had to say. He said, the violent attack on the heart of the Brazilian government by right-wing extremists is a sad but familiar sight. We stand with the people of Brazil, and we stand with democracy. And to Shawnee and Robert, I can tell you also that for many families, for many friends, this is an extremely polarizing issue, similar to what we have in the U.S., where politics has sort of taken hold and has become such a divisive and such a controversial topic for so many people. Of course, we'll be following everything that will happen. We know that at least 200 people have been arrested, so there is much more to come on this situation here during this vacation that I was having with my family, but it is what it is. That's what happens. Robert and Tashani, back over to you guys.
Dan, just real quickly, last night on Twitter, I see that Jair Bolsonaro sort of urged some calm. He criticized the protests while at the same time continuing to delegitimize the recent election. Any sign that that tweet is having an effect on these protesters?
That's a great point, Robert. It's a very kind of familiar way to put that out there, an apology, but also saying I still believe in what's happening. And we've heard that from so many people down here over the last several weeks, where they're saying the revolution is coming, the revolution is coming, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Bolsonaro supporters saying that this last election was rigged and that something was going to happen. Well, something did happen, and it was far worse than what people maybe expected. But when you talk about revolution, when you talk about these things, that is what we're talking about, what we're seeing in the Capitol there. So certainly there are points to be made about what Bolsonaro is saying now, where he's calling for this calm, and that's what you would hope that he would say in this scenario. And we're going to see what's going to happen today. Today's going to be a big day because the police did finally come in. They did finally move some of those folks out there. If there's going to be more, it certainly would happen again today. And that's when you'll know if things are going to be, how serious, how extremely tense things could potentially be in the next few days here, Robert.
Well, Dan, we are so appreciative of your reporting. Now go enjoy your vacation.
Okay, it's time for breakfast. A little coffee.
Thanks, Dan.